It was early morning on my ranch, the kind of morning where the sun spills gold across 1,300 acres of rolling hills, whispering through the tall grasses and the scattered oak trees that I had inherited a decade ago. Most people would look at this land and see nothing more than fields and fences. But for me, it was history, memory, and responsibility wrapped into one. Every acre had a story, every firebreak a purpose, and every tree a witness to years of storms, growth, and survival. I walked along the firebreak that bordered the western edge of my property, my boots crunching against the gravel as the cold air bit at my face. This firebreak wasn't just a line in the dirt. It was a shield, meticulously maintained to protect my land, my neighbors, and the delicate balance of this ecosystem. Every season, I inspected it, cleared brush, and reinforced it, knowing full well how quickly fire could turn from a manageable threat into an uncontrollable inferno. And yet, despite all my care, there was one person who seemed determined to ignore reason and science. Her name was Karen. To the outside world, she was just another HOA member, someone obsessed with the aesthetic perfection of the neighborhood. But behind her polite smiles and helpful suggestions lurked an ego so fragile and inflated it could have fueled a forest fire itself. It had started months ago, innocuous at first. A comment about how my firebreak didn't match the rest of the community's aesthetic. A suggestion to plant flowers along its edge, and then an insistence that the grasses be trimmed to precisely 3 inches. No exceptions. I laughed it off at first. Who cared if my firebreak looked like a natural line through the wilderness? Its purpose was survival, not beauty. But Karen did not see it that way. To her, uniformity mattered more than safety. Every encounter with Karen felt like a chess game with someone who had no understanding of the stakes. I could offer facts, research, and even personal experience, and she would counter with rules, community guidelines, and precedent. It was maddening, like arguing with a storm cloud that refused to move no matter how strong the wind. Neighbors began to notice the tension, though most wisely stayed out of it. Karen had a way of making people feel small, even when they were on the side of reason. She would smile sweetly in social gatherings, only to later send a passive-aggressive note demanding that I correct the unsightly firebreak immediately. It was petty, infuriating, and, frankly, dangerous. One afternoon, I received yet another letter from the HOA. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and screamed bureaucracy. I opened it slowly, knowing exactly what it would contain. Another complaint, another demand, another subtle threat of fines. Karen had done it again, complaining that my firebreak was detrimental to the neighborhood's overall aesthetic and distracting to residents. I stared at the paper for a long time. I had spent hours maintaining this firebreak, hours that could have saved lives if a wildfire ever came. Yet Karen had the audacity to prioritize her view over safety. My blood boiled, but I reminded myself to remain calm. This was only the beginning. The following week, she arrived in person, wearing her usual crisp white blouse and sunglasses that screamed self-importance. She stepped onto my property uninvited. "I just think the firebreak could use some improvements," she said, her tone syrupy sweet but edged with menace. "It really doesn't match the rest of the neighborhood." I wanted to laugh, but I swallowed it. "Karen, it's a firebreak. Its purpose is to stop fires, not please the eye. That's why it looks natural." Her smile tightened. "Natural isn't enough. People notice, They care about appearances." I could feel the frustration building, that tight coil in my chest that warns of an impending storm. But I held my ground. "I understand that, but if a fire starts here, all the aesthetics in the world won't matter. This line of cleared land could save dozens of homes. Do you really want to risk that?" She tilted her head, pretending to ponder my words, then shrugged as if dismissing a trivial concern. "We'll see," she said. "I'll be keeping an eye on things." And just like that, she left, her presence lingering like a shadow across the hills. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked the property again under a full moon, inspecting the firebreak by lantern light. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of small animals and the distant howl of coyotes. But the tranquility felt fragile, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to ignite. Not just in the grasslands, but in the storm brewing with Karen. I knew that this wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It was about control, ego, and a dangerous underestimation of consequences. Karen had no idea the kind of fire she was toying with, and I feared that it might be one that would spread far beyond her understanding. And deep down, I realized that sooner or later, her obsession with appearances was going to collide with reality in a way she couldn't control. Little did I know that collision would come sooner than anyone could imagine. And when it did, it would change everything. Not just for me, but for her entire HOA. Weeks passed, but Karen's obsession with my Firebreak did not waver. Every HOA meeting, every casual conversation in the neighborhood, she found some way to insert her critique. Her words were coated in sweetness, but beneath them was a venom that grew stronger with each passing day. She wasn't just concerned about appearances anymore. She wanted control, and that control would soon clash with the reality she refused to accept. I tried reasoning calmly, repeatedly. I showed her charts about fire spread, local fire codes, even historical wildfire maps. Each time, she nodded politely, smiled, and dismissed my logic. With the same words, "We'll see." Those two words became a drumbeat in my head, a rhythm of inevitable confrontation. Then came the day she crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I was inspecting the western edge of the property, noticing a patch of dry brush that had grown faster than I expected due to a hot, windy week. My instincts screamed at me, "Clear it immediately." But when I went to start the work, I found her standing there, a clipboard in hand, as if she owned the land itself. "You're damaging the look of the neighborhood," she said, her voice calm but icy. "That brush isn't supposed to be removed yet. It's part of the natural aesthetic." I stopped in my tracks, my hands on my hips. "Karen, this brush is dangerously dry. A single spark could set the hillside ablaze. I'm not removing it for looks. I'm removing it for safety." She smirked. "Safety is subjective. I think the community would prefer it if you left it." I took a deep breath, counting to 10. My patience was fraying. "Karen, I am telling you, this is not a suggestion. This firebreak exists to protect lives, property, and the integrity of the land. Your aesthetics do not override fire safety laws." She tilted her head, her expression that same mix of innocence and menace. "Laws are one thing, beauty is another. You're letting practicality cloud your judgment." I shook my head. "It's practicality that prevents destruction, Karen. It's not a matter of opinion." But she didn't budge. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the road, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "We'll see how practical it really is," she said over her shoulder. Her words lingered in the air like smoke, and in the back of my mind, I felt a chill. Something about her tone suggested she had more in mind than simply complaining. Over the next few days, reports came in from neighbors. Small brush fires, unusual smoke patterns. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to set my nerves on edge. And always, in the background, Karen's comments, emails, and notes demanding that the firebreak look more pleasing continued. I realized then that this wasn't just petty interference. It was sabotage waiting to happen. And the worst part? I had no way to prove intent. Yet, one afternoon, I drove the length of my property in my pickup, scanning the horizon. The land rolled endlessly beneath the sun, golden waves of dry grasses swaying in the wind. The air smelled of heat and earth, of dust and pine. And then I saw it. A faint curl of smoke rising in the distance, near the very edge of the western firebreak. My heart clenched. I jumped out of the truck, running toward it. The brush fire had already begun, small but growing, greedy for oxygen. My boots tore through the dry grasses as I fought to reach the spot before it spread. Each step felt heavier, the wind carrying a faint acrid smell that made my eyes sting. By the time I reached the source, it was clear what had happened. Someone had started the fire deliberately, a line of scorched earth cut too cleanly, too perfectly to be an accident. My stomach sank. Karen's words echoed in my mind. "We'll see how practical it really is." I grabbed a shovel, water, anything to stop it, but the fire was fast, impatient, and the wind was against me. The flames licked at the edges of the firebreak, threatening to leap over. I fought with everything I had, sweat running down my face, lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I could see the fire dancing across the ridge, ready to spill into the valley below. At that moment, I realized two terrifying things. 1. The danger was far greater than I had anticipated. 2. Karen's obsession had now become a threat to everyone, not just me. And if the fire jumped this firebreak, it wouldn't just consume my land. It would move straight into her precious HOA, into the homes she cared about so deeply. I tried calling the fire department, but the signal was weak, my phone barely catching a single bar. Every second felt like minutes, every gust of wind a potential disaster. I grabbed a hose, dousing patches of flame as best I could, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't hold it off alone, but the stakes were clear. If this fire spread, there would be no turning back. And then came the moment that made my blood run cold. From the corner of my eye, I saw her, Karen, standing at the edge of the road, watching the fire with that same calm, measured expression. Not running, not panicking, just watching. I shouted, "Karen, get out of here. This is dangerous." She turned, her smile faint but chilling. "I'm observing," she said simply. "It's educational." In that instant, everything clicked. She hadn't accidentally ignored the firebreak rules. She had deliberately compromised safety for her own satisfaction, her own twisted sense of control over the land. And now, she was witnessing the consequences firsthand, with a terrifying sense of detachment. The fire hissed, consuming dry leaves, twigs, and brush. The wind pushed it closer to the ridgeline. My hands were blistered, my muscles screaming, but I refused to give up. Every ounce of knowledge, every hour spent maintaining firebreaks, every bit of instinct I had honed over the years was being tested in real time. And deep down, I realized something else. This fire would not only test me, it would test Karen too. Because soon, very soon, she would learn that aesthetics could never outweigh nature, that control was an illusion in the face of disaster, and that the consequences of her actions were coming whether she was ready or not. The first spark had been set. The stage was prepared, and nothing would ever be the same again. The wind had turned. What was once a manageable threat now became a ravenous, unpredictable force. The fire, small at first, had grown into a wall of orange and black, hungrily consuming every dry blade of grass, every dead twig, every vulnerable shrub in its path. Smoke thickened the air, choking the senses and painting the sky in an ominous haze that swallowed the morning sun. I stood at the edge of my property, sweat streaking my dirt-smudged face, muscles trembling from hours of desperate labor. The firebreak, a line I had meticulously maintained, was under assault. But no matter how wide, how deep, how reinforced, fire is a master of defiance, finding the tiniest weakness and exploiting it. "Come on, hold," I muttered, shoveling dirt and swinging hoses with frantic energy, trying to hold the flames at bay. The crackling, popping sound was deafening, like some angry beast testing its teeth. My heart pounded as embers danced on the wind, threatening to leap across the firebreak I had spent years maintaining. And then I saw it. A rogue gust picked up, hurling sparks directly toward the far side of the ridge. My stomach sank as I realized the worst-case scenario was unfolding. If the fire jumped, it would move beyond my property, and straight toward Karen's precious HOA. I ran toward the ridge, adrenaline making my legs fly over uneven terrain. The smell of burning earth, resin, and wood filled my lungs, acrid and suffocating. Smoke stung my eyes, blurred my vision, and coated everything in a thin layer of ash. I could hear the distant screams of neighbors as they fled in panic. Cars screeched along narrow roads, engines choked by smoke, tires crunching on gravel. Karen was there on the edge of the neighborhood, staring. She didn't move, didn't run, didn't call for help. She simply watched. Her clipboard lay forgotten at her feet, a useless token in the face of disaster she had invited. "Karen, get out of here," I shouted, my voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. But she didn't budge. Her gaze was fixed, almost fascinated, as if this inferno were some grand experiment she was conducting. My anger flared. This isn't a game. People's lives are at risk. She tilted her head. I just wanted it to look right, she said, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around her. I clenched my fists. There was no reasoning with her. Not now. Not ever. The fire spread faster than anything I had experienced. Trees that had stood for decades erupted in flames, sending showers of sparks skyward. Dry brush became kindling, igniting neighboring yards like matchsticks. Panic enveloped the HOA as families grabbed children, pets, and valuables, fleeing down smoke-filled streets. Every second mattered. Every delay could mean disaster. I ran to a water pump, connecting hoses, directing streams at the advancing fire. My clothes were soaked in sweat and ash. My arms burned from the heat radiating off the flames. Yet I refused to stop. Couldn't. Not when lives were on the line. Not when Karen's reckless obsession had turned into a tangible, roaring threat. In the distance, I saw the first roofs ignite. Flames licked shingles, windows shattered from the heat, and a column of smoke rose into the sky, blacker and heavier than before. The fire had breached her HOA, and suddenly, her obsession with perfection became ironic in the most terrifying way. Neighbors screamed at her, some trying to reach her, but she stood frozen, staring at the chaos she had inadvertently caused. I could see the horror dawning on her face, the first real understanding that control and appearances could never command nature. I fought back tears as I continued battling the fire. Memories of this land, the years of hard work, the meticulous care I had invested. It all seemed fragile against the raw, untamable force of flames. And yet, there was no giving up. This was my home, my land, my responsibility. Hours passed. The fire department finally arrived. Sirens wailing, engines spitting water, hoses unfurling across streets. The battle was far from over, but reinforcements meant hope. Still, the damage was staggering. Acres of my land charred, homes damaged, and the HOA that had once judged me now at the mercy of the very disaster they had ignored until it was too late. Karen finally moved, tears streaking her face, realizing the destruction that had unfolded. She tried to apologize, to rationalize, but words could not undo the chaos. The fire had made its statement, and the consequences were unavoidable. I stood amidst the smoke, ash falling like gray snow around me, feeling the weight of exhaustion and disbelief. And yet, beneath the devastation, there was clarity. Nature does not negotiate with ego. Safety cannot be sacrificed for appearances. And those who ignore the power of reality, the forces they cannot control, will eventually face the consequences. That night, as firefighters continued to battle lingering flames, I walked the perimeter of what remained. The land smelled of charred earth and burnt wood, but also of resilience. Every scorched tree, every blackened ridge, reminded me that while destruction is inevitable, survival requires preparation, foresight, and respect for the forces we cannot command. And somewhere in the neighborhood, Karen sat in stunned silence, finally realizing that her obsession with aesthetics had triggered a fire that no amount of beauty could contain. The inferno had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. The fire had taught a brutal lesson. Control is an illusion, and consequences are inevitable when arrogance meets reality. The morning after the fire was eerily quiet. Smoke still curled in thin gray tendrils over the blackened landscape, drifting lazily across the hills where flames had danced just hours before. The sun, though bright, did little to warm the chill of shock that settled over the property and the neighborhood. I stepped outside, surveying the damage. My firebreak, once a meticulously maintained line of protection, was now charred and scarred, but it had held in the areas that mattered. My land had suffered, yes, but far worse was the scene in the HOA. The perfectly manicured lawns, the colorful flower beds, the neat rows of homes that Karen had obsessed over, all now blackened, singed, or completely destroyed. The irony was bitter, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Karen emerged from the remnants of her HOA, her expression a mixture of disbelief, fear, and dawning comprehension. She had spent months criticizing me for prioritizing safety over aesthetics. Yet here she stood, confronted with the consequences of her obsession. Her HOA, her perfect little kingdom, had fallen victim to the very forces she had ignored, denied, and underestimated. Neighbors wandered the streets, some crying, some shaking their heads in stunned silence. The air was thick with ash and tension. People who had once gossiped about my firebreak, who had silently supported Karen's relentless critiques, now looked at me differently. Some with gratitude, some with guilt. I could feel their eyes, their judgments transformed into recognition. The firebreak wasn't a cosmetic choice. It had been a lifeline. Karen finally spoke, her voice trembling. I didn't think it would. I didn't mean. She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. As if words themselves were inadequate to describe the catastrophe. I approached cautiously, not out of fear, but to assert calm in the chaos. Karen? I said, my voice steady despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding reality. Nature doesn't negotiate, and fire doesn't care about appearances. You were warned, and now the consequences are clear. She nodded mutely, tears streaking her ash-smudged face. There was no excuse strong enough, no rationale to shield her from the impact of what had happened. The fire had become the final arbiter, revealing the truth that her ego had ignored. Aesthetics mean nothing when safety is at stake. I walked through the burned HOA, noting the remnants of homes, the smoke-tinged furniture, and the destroyed gardens. Every step was a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets ignorance. Every blackened lawn was a lesson in humility. And yet, amid the devastation, there were glimmers of resilience. Plants that had survived, fences still standing, and a few structures that, with effort, could be salvaged. Life, stubborn and tenacious, was pushing back against the fire's destructive force. As firefighters worked to contain lingering hotspots, I spoke to neighbors, offering guidance, resources, and reassurance. Some were angry, others thankful, and a few were silent, processing their shock. Karen stood nearby, watching but no longer interfering. Her power over appearances had vanished. Her influence was reduced to witnessing the damage firsthand. She had lost control entirely, and for the first time she understood what real consequences felt like. In the following days, investigations began. Authorities assessed the fire, the damage, and the causes. While the fire had been fueled by extreme dryness and wind, the fact that critical firebreaks were altered or neglected due to aesthetic interference became a focal point. Karen's obsessive interventions were documented, and she faced the reality that her personal preferences had endangered lives and property. Meanwhile, my property, though scarred, had survived better than the HOA. The firebreaks I had maintained did their job, preventing total destruction. I walked the ridges and valleys, surveying the land, feeling a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and vindication. Nature had tested me, and preparation had made the difference. Karen eventually approached me again, this time without her clipboard, without her clipped instructions, without the pretense of authority. She looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by the fire but by her own realization. I see now, she whispered. I was wrong. I didn't understand. I nodded, the anger in me replaced by something quieter, more reflective. It's not just about being right or wrong, Karen. It's about respect for nature, for others, and for the forces we cannot control. I hope you remember that. The fire had taught a brutal lesson, one written across the hills and neighborhoods in blackened ash and charred timber. But lessons, when learned deeply, carry the power to change behavior, to shift perspective, and to forge respect where there had been arrogance. As I stood atop a ridge, looking down at the aftermath, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The land was scarred, yes, but it had survived. The HOA, once a symbol of control and perfection, had crumbled under the weight of reality. And Karen, once a tyrant of aesthetics, now faced the undeniable truth of her actions. The consequences were clear, the lessons unforgettable. And I realized that in the end, survival and wisdom often outweigh appearances, ego and pride. The fire had done its work, not just in burning, but in revealing truths that were long ignored. Nature had spoken. Karen had listened whether she wanted to or not. And the landscape, though blackened and broken, held the promise of recovery, resilience, and a new understanding that would shape both the land and its people forever. Weeks passed, and the smoke finally cleared. The hills, once shrouded in gray haze, now revealed blackened ridges and scorched earth. But life was already pushing back. Green shoots peeked from the ash, stubbornly claiming their space, reminding me that resilience is stronger than destruction. My property, though wounded, had survived the inferno largely intact. The firebreaks I had meticulously maintained had held, protecting not only my land but also saving lives. Karen, on the other hand, had become a different figure entirely. The woman who had once wielded aesthetics like a weapon now walked silently among the remnants of her HOA, her steps hesitant, her face marked by guilt and the weight of consequences. No longer did she issue demands or comment on appearances. Instead, she observed, measured, and reflected. I could see the transformation in her posture, in her gaze. The arrogance had melted, replaced by the humility that only a stark confrontation with reality can instill. The neighborhood slowly rebuilt. Neighbors who had fled in panic returned, their conversations filled with cautious optimism and gratitude. Many approached me, offering thanks, apologies, and even friendship. They had seen firsthand the value of preparation, the necessity of listening to those who understood the land, and the cost of ignoring danger in favor of appearances. My role shifted naturally, from property owner to guardian, teacher, and steady presence amid chaos. Karen approached me one afternoon, standing at the edge of her now charred lawn. She avoided eye contact at first, then finally met my gaze, her voice low and tentative. I never realized. I didn't understand how serious it was. I'm sorry. I nodded, accepting her apology but knowing that forgiveness was more about recognition than absolution. Actions have consequences, Karen. What matters is that you learn from this, that you respect forces you cannot control. That respect isn't just for nature. It's for yourself, your neighbors, and everyone whose lives intersect with your choices. For the first time, she nodded fully, acknowledging the lesson in a way that words alone could not convey. The fire had not only destroyed what she cherished but had also reshaped her understanding. Ego and appearances had given way to awareness, humility, and, hopefully, growth. As I walked the property later that day, the sun casting long golden shadows across the hills, I felt a profound sense of closure. The fire had tested me, my land, and the people around me. It had pushed us to the brink, forcing us to confront not only physical destruction but also human flaws, pride, obsession, and the failure to respect forces beyond our control. And yet there was hope. The firebreaks remained, charred but functional, a testament to foresight and preparation. The land, wounded but alive, whispered promises of renewal. Life would return, stronger, wiser, and more vigilant. And the lessons learned here would ripple outward, shaping how decisions were made, how conflicts were handled, and how respect for the natural world was maintained. Karen's HOA eventually rebuilt, but differently this time. Gone were the obsessive demands about appearances. Instead, meetings focused on safety, preparedness, and collaboration. Karen herself participated differently, her voice tempered by the memory of the fire, her perspective forever altered. No longer was she a tyrant of aesthetics. She had become, grudgingly perhaps, an advocate for caution and foresight. I too changed. My connection to the land deepened. My understanding of the delicate balance between human influence and natural forces sharpened. The fire had reminded me that even the most carefully maintained property is vulnerable, that control is often an illusion, and that vigilance, knowledge, and respect are the only true safeguards against disaster. As I stood atop the ridge, overlooking the reborn landscape, I felt a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet triumph. The hills were scarred, yes, but they were alive. The fire had taken much, but it had given more: clarity, transformation, and the undeniable truth that when arrogance and obsession meet reality, consequences are inevitable. But so too is growth, if we are willing to learn. And in the distance, I saw Karen, tending to a new garden along the edge of her rebuilt lawn. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if every action carried meaning. She had survived the fire, witnessed the cost of her obsession, and learned, perhaps too late, but still, what truly mattered. The story of that fire, of the land, and of the woman who had once valued appearances over life, became a lesson whispered across the hills, carried on the wind through the trees, and remembered in the hearts of those who lived through it. It was a story of destruction and survival, of arrogance and humility, of chaos and renewal. And most importantly, it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it: nature does not negotiate, and respect is the only safeguard against the fires we cannot control.